Now that we've had a brief overview introducing the divine counsel, the whole concept there, I want to take you into the divine counsel worldview. Again, this is basically just another term for biblical theology. Subtitle here, Cosmic Geography and Salvation's Plan in Biblical Theology. The divine counsel, which is really God's rule through his heavenly host or his non-human imagers, has a direct intersection with his human imagers, life on earth. Yeah, the biblical story, as it were, is really about the restoration of God's rule on earth through his imagers, whether they be human or non-human, to restore Eden, to reenact, restore, whatever word you want to use, his original plan to live with his human creations, those who are like him, who image him, along with his invisible family, his spiritual family, his non-human divine family, to have us all as one family on earth, administering, stewarding the creation, which was at the beginning just a little slice of creation, just a little part of the globe. But God wanted, through his promise and his covenant, his command, his mandate to Adam and Eve, to make the rest of the world like Eden, where he lived and they lived with him. And so that post-fall is where biblical theology moves, how to restore that. And so the divine counsel, the unseen realm, is an inextricable part of what's happening with us. And it's often neglected. I remember in Bible college and seminary, angelology got 2 days attention. It's something that's totally peripheral, which is a huge mistake in biblical theology. So we're going to just take a look at the overarching worldview that emerges from this, and I think you'll see pretty clearly how all-encompassing this sort of thing is. So we'll begin in Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9. And again, this is the sort of thing I'm going to be presuming as I go through passages on a weekly basis to teach you. But Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9 is sort of a fundamental passage. If you read it, we have here, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is his allotted heritage. Jacob, of course, being another word for Israel. Jacob is Israel. So what do we have here? When did the Most High divide up the nations? When did he allot humankind to specific nations and fix their borders? Well, that's obviously a reference to the Tower of Babel. Now, this is the ESV. And this phrase here, according to the number of the sons of God, does not appear in many other translations. Same thing with verse 43, same chapter, Deuteronomy 32, where we read, "Rejoice with him, O heavens," could be translated, "O heavenly ones. Bow down to him, all gods." In other words, these gods right here, there's a relationship here. These gods, the sons of God, that God allotted to the nations. Notice when he divides up the nations, he fixes their borders. He divides them up according to the number of the sons of God. We're going to be looking at some other passages. Essentially, this is the Old Testament rationale for why we have other gods, where the other pantheons came from of the Gentile nations, the nations who were not the Lord's portion, the nations who were not Israel. This is the Old Testament world after Babel. Nations divided up, assigned to other gods, and in Deuteronomy 4:19 and 20 we see that the gods were assigned to them. But these gods were supposed to be obedient. They were supposed to be obedient to the God of Israel, to Yahweh, the one who did all this, the one who was superior and supreme. I'm going to click out to Deuteronomy 32 here. And just so I can show you the footnotes here, ESV version again, we have here number 2, compare Dead Sea Scrolls Septuagint Okay, that's where this reading comes from, the number of the sons of God. That is directly from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's reflected in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The Masoretic text, though, the text that most English translations are based on, reads sons of Israel. Get that up again, sons of Israel. Now, it doesn't make any sense. If we're talking about the Babel event, when God divides up the nations, dividing them up according to the number of the sons of Israel, not only is that a textually inferior reading, again, the sons of God is the reading that comes from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Sons of Israel does not. It's much later. It's in the Masoretic text. But not only is it an inferior textual reading, and you can read all about it. I did a journal article for Dallas Seminary's Journal on the text critical issues in this verse. But it's also illogical. Israel didn't exist at the time of Babel. Israel is not listed in the table of nations connected with the Babel event. It makes no sense to number something according to the number of the sons of Israel because Israel didn't exist in biblical history at that point. So it's obviously a sort of covert reading. It's something that was put into the text at a later time for various reasons. The scholars have different theories about this. And again, this is not news to anyone in the academic community who does Old Testament studies. It's a very well-known verse, very well-known textual issue here. But just on a purely logical level with biblical history and biblical theology, it makes no sense to say sons of Israel because there was no Israel. So let's go back here and take a look at what we're talking about. Again, at the Babel event, we have in Genesis 11, the prior chapter, Genesis 10, is the so-called Table of Nations. We get a list of the nations of the known world at the time to the biblical writer. If you count these up, the number is either going to be 70 in the Masoretic text or 72 in the Septuagint, and it's based upon whether two of the terms are put together or divided. But either way, it's a reference. Either number 70 or 72 is a reference back to the Babel event and this listing. It's a number that's going to come up later in the New Testament when Jesus sends out his disciples. That's going to be interesting. I don't know if we'll get to that in our little talk here, but it's part of the cosmic geography of the Old Testament. But these nations right here are the ones that get divided up. These are the ones that the biblical writers know. Israel, of course, is Yahweh's own portion. All the other nations are assigned to lesser Elohim, assigned to the sons of God. They are allotted to the sons of God, put under their authority so that those gods govern those nations now. This is a punishment in the wake of Babel. I actually refer to this event in Deuteronomy 32:8-9 as the Romans 1 event of the Old Testament. You know, Romans 1 talks about how God gave people up to their own sins, and they get what they deserve, and you know what they wanted, God gave them and said, well, you know, it's going to cost you. This is going to destroy you. You know, you're going to be a slave to sin and all this stuff. Well, this is what's going on here in the Old Testament. What you have here is God giving up the nations. Up until the time of Babel, he had been working with humanity. He'd taken them out of the flood. He reiterated the covenant to Noah and said, now go disperse over the earth. Of course, they don't do that. They want to call God down at Babel. That's the tower, the quote-unquote tower they're building. Pretty much all Old Testament scholars believe that that's a ziggurat in a Mesopotamian context. And it's a temple complex. It's part of a temple complex. It's where you call God to you. And God says, no, this isn't what I said. I said go and disperse the nations, because the whole program here is about spreading my good rule over the whole earth, restoring Eden, making the globe Edenic, being my people and doing this in obedience to me. But they don't. They rebel. And so consequently, God says, fine, if you don't want to listen to me, I'm going to put you under the authority of other gods, other lesser Elohim that report to me, and you're going to have to deal with them. Now, I want them to administer justice and all this sort of stuff. Psalm 82, which we looked at in the last video, is God looking at the gods of the council and saying, you have corrupted judgment. If you read the whole psalm, that's what it's about. God is taking the Elohim of his council to task At the end of the psalmist says, rise up, O God, and reclaim the nations. Take the nations. Take the nations back. This is the logic behind, as we'll see in the New Testament, we eventually get into the New Testament era, the nations have to be reclaimed. They're reclaimed with the gospel. Acts 2 is going to factor into this picture. We'll get there in a moment. None of this is accidental or coincidental. But the Old Testament view of what's going on is that at Babel, God said, Yahweh, the God of Israel, said, enough of this. I'm abandoning you. I'm disinheriting you. I'm putting you under the authority of other gods. And you know what I'm going to do now? I'm going to create my own people. Jacob is my portion. Israel is my portion. That's why in the very next chapter of Genesis, chapter 12, what does God do? Right after Babel, he calls Abraham. And he makes a covenant with Abraham and says, I'm going to take you, and it's going to be through you that I'm going to raise up my own family, my own seed. Okay? The new Eden, the new Edenic program here, run through Israel. And so the rest of the Old Testament is the story of Israel against the nations, Yahweh against the other gods, because the other gods eventually are going to rebel, and they're going to seduce Israel to worship them instead of Yahweh. Now, this picture, again, the disinheritance of the nations, the call of Abraham in the next chapter, it's actually reflected in the New Testament in a number of places. We're just going to go to one. Look at what Paul says here in his sermon at the Areopagus. He says, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place. Okay, this is a hearkening back to Babel. Why? Why did he do that? Well, he disinherits them, puts them under the other gods, but the whole purpose, because he calls Abraham right after he punishes the nations and assigns them to other gods. He calls Abraham. Remember what God said to Abraham? Through you, all nations of the earth will be blessed. Why does he do that? Verse 27, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us. This is part of Paul's message, the reclaiming of the nations that were disinherited back at Babel and put under the authority of other gods who become hostile to Israel and seduce the Israelites, Yahweh's people, away from him. And again, this is the Old Testament story. Israel against the nations, Yahweh against their gods. Let's look at a couple other passages. In Deuteronomy 4:19 and 20, this is the parallel passage to Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9. Moses, again, it is part of one of Moses' sermons. He says, beware, lest you raise your eyes to the heaven when you see the sun, the moon, and the stars, and all the host of heaven, that you be drawn away and bow down to them and serve them, things that the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. So right here, we have it again. This idea that the heavenly host, again, the divine beings that are, in the spiritual realm here, God has allotted them to these other nations. Okay? But the Lord has taken you, Israel, and brought you out of the iron furnace, out of Egypt, to be a people of his own inheritance. Remember back in Deuteronomy 32:8, 9, Israel is Yahweh's portion, as you are this day. Let's take a look at another one. Now, you got host of heaven language here. Back in Deuteronomy 32:8, it was sons of God. Keep those phrases in mind. Host of heaven, sons of God. We get up to Deuteronomy 17, and we read this. If there is found among you within any of your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, a man or woman who does what is evil in the sight of the Lord your God in transgressing his covenant, and has gone and served other gods and worshipped them, or the sun or the moon or any of the host of heaven, which I have forbidden. So here we are in chapter 17 now, tracking through Deuteronomy. These same gods that were allotted to the nations, the God of Israel says to his own people, Israel, you must not worship them. Okay, you must not worship them. I am the Lord your God. The Shema, Deuteronomy 6. The Lord our God is one. Okay, the Lord our God. Okay, the Lord our God is one. And we can talk about what one means. Again, it has interesting divine council connections, because ultimately the nations were supposed to be drawn back to the one God. Israel was the conduit through which that would happen. But again, those are subjects for another time. I'm trying to just give you a rough overview. Deuteronomy 29. Let's go there. We have here, if Israel, again, does evil, worships these other gods, and gets overthrown like Sodom and Gomorrah, all the nations will say, why has the Lord done this thus to his land? What caused the heat of his anger? And then the people will say, it is because they abandoned the covenant of the Lord, the God of their fathers, which he made with them and when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. What'd they do? Well, they went and served other gods and worshiped them. Which gods? Gods whom they had not known and whom he had not allotted to them. See, he allotted the other nations to other gods. Deuteronomy 32, 8, 9. But Israel was Yahweh's portion alone. He took them for himself because he created them right after he disinherited the nations in Genesis 11 at Babel. Then he called Abraham and began his own people again, disinheriting everybody else. But he didn't forget them, because when he made the covenant with Abraham, he said, look, those who bless you I will bless, those who curse you I will curse, and in you, or through you, all nations of the earth will be blessed. He didn't forget them, but he did disinherit them for a time. Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9, we saw that these were the other gods allotted to the nations, and the nations allotted to them, two sides of the same coin. Well, what happened? How's the story end? Here we are. Doesn't end well. They, the Israelites, sacrificed to demons, not God. We saw this verse in our earlier video about the divine council. They sacrificed to gods they had not known. Again, this is committing evil. This is what God warned them through Moses not to do in Deuteronomy 17. It was why he is going to punish them, the warning that was given in Deuteronomy 29. Here it happens in Deuteronomy 32. These are the gods, again, back in verses 8 and 9 of Deuteronomy 32, that were allotted to the other nations. Israel fails. Israel sins. They were supposed to, if you remember verse 43, the way it was supposed to work was that the other gods were supposed to bow down to Yahweh, but they did not. They seduced the Israelites. They became hostile to what God was trying to do. And Psalm 82, which we saw in the previous video about the divine council, is God saying, you know what? You're going to be punished. You're corrupt. You didn't obey. You're going to die like men. Okay, you're going to die like a human does. I'm going to remove your immortality. Now, we know from other passages and other places in the Old Testament that vision of that happening is eschatological. It comes future to the Old Testament. What we're going to see here in a moment is that the beginning of the undoing of the grip of the gods on the nations happens when Jesus shows up, and especially when he dies, rises again, and the gospel, at the Pentecost event, penetrates the nations, permeates the nations with the message about Jesus, of the Messiah. And that is the beginning of the advance of the kingdom of God and the diminishing, the undermining of all these other kingdoms, all these other controls that the gods have over the nations. Back into the Old Testament, though, this whole idea, again, that an Israelite, a biblical writer, looked at the world in such a way that Israel, the land promised to Abraham and his descendants, was holy ground. Okay, this is where Yahweh was to be worshipped. Yahweh owned this land. It's not that Yahweh doesn't own the earth. There's plenty of other passages like that. But there's this territorial sense that the nations around Israel are governed. They're under the authority of hostile gods, hostile divine entities. Now, God says, I'm going to deal with them. But for the time being, those gods are, in the mind of the biblical writer, real, and they're a threat. They're serious. They are not to be worshipped. They are to be avoided. And so when you were not in Israel, when you were not in holy ground, you were somewhere else. You were in the domain of another. that, yes, the God of Israel had assigned that turf to one of these other divine beings. So we know, who's superior. But it's still a scary thing. It's still a threat. You're still on territory that was not promised to you by covenant with your God, with the God of Israel. This helps to explain a number of different passages. Let's go to 1 Samuel 26. When David, again, is fleeing from Saul, he winds up, in different parts of that whole episode, that whole fiasco, running from Saul and whatnot. In this particular passage, 1 Samuel 26, David, again, has come upon Saul and has spared his life. And look at what he says. When he's going back and forth with Saul, he says, "Now therefore let my lord the king hear the words of his servant. If it is the Lord who has stirred you up against me, may he accept an offering. But if it is man, may he be cursed before the Lord. For they have driven me out this day, that I should have no share in the inheritance of the Lord, saying, go serve other gods." Again, is David denying the omnipresence of God? No. What he's saying is, look, I'm no longer in Israel. You're chasing me all over the place. And there are times I get driven out beyond the boundaries of Yahweh's land, the land promised to us. And the people who are doing that say, go somewhere else and have another God, worship other gods. Again, it's this sort of consciousness that Israel is holy ground. Any other ground is not. Okay, it's under the dominion of another entity. 2 Kings 5:17. I won't click there, I'll just summarize this. This is one of my favorite stories. It's the story of Naaman the leper with Elisha. Remember, Naaman, he's from Syria. He's a captain, important military guy, works with the king there. But Syria is a foreign land, under foreign dominion, foreign gods, the god Ramon, in fact, as we learn in the passage. He has leprosy, and one of his little servant girls, who's a captive Israelite, says, "Hey, why don't you go over to Israel and Elisha will heal you?" I mean, we know this story. And so he does. He gets some of his men, he goes over there, and Elisha won't even meet with him. He says, through an intermediary, well, just go wash in the Jordan 7 times and you'll be clean. And Naaman gets mad, because it's like the Jordan, this little trickle. I mean, we have better rivers, where I come from. And he gets into an argument, and his servants, his men, say, look, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, then you would have done it. Why don't you just go do it? See what happens. And so Naaman does. And sure enough, he's cured of his leprosy. He comes back and he says to Elisha, now I know that Yahweh is the God of gods. I know now. And so do we remember the story? We remember that much. That's what gets told in church and Sunday school, but it misses a detail. What does Naaman ask for from Elisha when he goes back? He asks Elisha, would it be okay if I fill up some bags of dirt? I want to take dirt back with me as much as my mules can carry. I want to take dirt with me because when I go back home, I'm an important guy, and I have to go into the temple of Ramon with the king, and the king's kind of old and he leans on me, and we're not really told if Naaman has to sort of go through the motions with the king there, but he's got to take the king there and take care of him. It's part of his job. So he says to Elisha, would it be okay if I take dirt back with me? Now that only makes sense in terms of cosmic geography, because what he wanted was he identified the ground of Israel as holy, as belonging to Yahweh. So we're not told exactly what he would do with it. Maybe he took a little with him. Maybe he sprinkled some on the ground when he had to go on the territory of Ramon, the foreign god. Maybe he could carry a little bit with him in his pockets or whatever. He wants dirt because he wants to be on holy ground, because his faith is now in Yahweh, the God of Israel, not Ramon. Now he knows who is God. Again, it's a great passage that's only decipherable in the context of cosmic geography that originates with what happened at Babel. Daniel 10 is the same thing. We have the prince of Persia, the prince of Greece. These are divine beings. at least that much. It doesn't rule out that they're working with human authorities, but at the very least, we've got, again, divine authorities over these nations, because we learn that Michael is in charge of Israel. He has been given the caretaking of Israel. And we notice that in Daniel chapter 12, verse 1 too. It's cosmic geography. Again, it's just the same old thing. And again, these aren't the only passages that get into this, but I think they're good illustrations. Now let's go to the New Testament. How does this factor into the New Testament? Well, it factors in a big way in the book of Acts, and specifically at Pentecost. And we all know this story, but you don't really know the story. If we look in Acts 2, when the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place. And suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting, and divided tongues as of fire, so on and so forth. Now, I've clicked on the word divided for a reason here. The Greek lemma is diamorizo. If we searched for that Greek lemma in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, guess where it shows up? Deuteronomy 32, verse 8. Okay, the whole thing about when the Most High divided up, right here we have it, hote, when, diamorizen, third masculine singular form, ha hupsistos, when the Most High divided up ethne, the nations, right there it is. Acts 2 is using this vocabulary drawn from Deuteronomy 32. Well, why would they do that? Why would Luke do that? Let's just keep looking here. Keep going in Acts chapter 2, verse 5. Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And at this sound the multitude came together, and they were bewildered. You know, when all this freaky stuff starts happening in Acts chapter 2, they're bewildered. Well, what's going on? Because each one was hearing them speak in his own language. Well, this time I've clicked on the word bewildered for a reason. The lemma, Greek lemma, is sunkeo. If we look this one up in the Septuagint, Greek translation of the Old Testament, guess where this one shows up? Genesis 11. What's Genesis 11? The Tower of Babel incident, when the nations were divided. Okay, what Luke is doing is he's putting little toeholds, little links, little bridges from the day of Pentecost back to the dividing of the nations in Genesis 11 and Deuteronomy 32. He wants his readers to mentally go back to that event, because that event is the precursor, it is the backdrop, it is the framework for what happens in Acts chapter 2. Now, Acts chapter 2, we read about what happens. The Spirit comes upon the followers of Jesus. They're enabled to speak in all these other languages. Who's there at Pentecost? Well, it's Jews from where? From all over the known world. All the nations. All the nations have some Jews living in them. It's like cell groups. You know, God has providentially used the disaster of the exile and the diaspora, all this stuff, to plant his people in these nations that he knows he will reclaim. And they're living there. And when it comes time for Pentecost, lots of them are going to come back to Jerusalem. And on this particular occasion, they come back to Jerusalem, and it's after the resurrection of this guy, Jesus of Nazareth, and they hear the message of Peter, and they see what happens in Acts chapter 2, the mighty rushing wind, the divided, the cloven tongues, the divided tongues. Everybody's been enabled to speak the gospel in all these different languages. This is infiltration. This is divine infiltration of the nations with the gospel. And the crazy thing is, if you read through Acts chapter 2, and you look at those nations, again, the ones in red here are the ones that are actually mentioned, the list, just watch this, the list starts over here in the east. This is the farthest penetration of the Jews during and after the exile. This is Mesopotamia. Okay, this is part of the Persian Empire. This is where Esther, winds up and all this sort of stuff, the Medes and the Persians. There are still Jews living here after the return from exile. So Acts chapter 2 tracks through, from the east, all the places where the Jews are living among the nations and starts moving west. Okay, and when it hits the Mediterranean, it heads north and south, the list. Right here and here, it's moving west till finally, in Acts chapter 2, we hit Italy. But all this turf, okay, was ground that was known, nations that were known back in Genesis 10, back at the Babel event. It is a subtle sign to the intelligent reader that what's happening at Pentecost is divine infiltration and the beginning of taking every nation back through the Messiah, through Jesus. Look at the way Acts unfolds. Acts 2 is Pentecost. The story takes up, after Pentecost in Jerusalem, then it expands to Judea, Acts chapter 2 through 8. You get to Acts 8, and look at the places, look at the geography where things happen in Acts. Samaria. What's Samaria? Well, Samaria was the apostate northern kingdom of Israel in the Old Testament. Samaria is part of the Acts story. Why? Because God wants you to know that I'm taking that back too. It's not just the nations, it's everything. Ethiopia, the Ethiopian eunuch, the last Jew. Why is Ethiopia associated with Jews? Because historically, it is. There were Jews who fled here in ancient times, fled the onslaught of Nebuchadnezzar, and even earlier. We know that there were significant Jewish colonies in Egypt and other parts of Africa, down into Ethiopia, Cush. And Cush, of course, is mentioned in the Table of Nations. So Cush doesn't get mentioned back here in Acts 2, but it gets picked off the list right here in Acts chapter 8. Lo and behold. Then what happens in Acts chapter 9? Paul's converted. Who's Paul? Paul is the apostle to who? To the Gentiles, to the nations. Jerusalem, Judea, and here we go. Everybody else. Paul is going to track through as many of these places, these nations, as he can. Okay, Acts chapter 9, in conjunction with the conversion of Paul, we have Damascus mentioned. Well, what's Damascus? Damascus is the northernmost point at which Abraham set foot back in Genesis 14. It is encompassed within the promises given to Abraham for the land. Remember when God said, hey, look, everywhere is, wherever your foot treads, that's what I'm going to give this land to you? When Abraham goes and chases the kings who kidnapped Lot back in Genesis 14, this is where he stops. Again, it's telegraphing a message. Everything that belongs to me, I am taking. And it all belongs to me, but it's systematic. To someone who knew their Old Testament, this isn't going to be missed. Cornelius, the first Gentile convert. The program is underway here. Missionary journeys, Acts 11 to 19, under Paul. What's he doing? Paul is driven by the concept, he reads in passages like Isaiah 66, of reclaiming the nations. It's called in the New Testament the fullness of the Gentiles. I have people in every nation. I'm going to get them. I am going to slowly reclaim all the nations, all the people in those nations that are mine. The kingdom of God is going to overspread them. And eventually, at the end of days, the day of the Lord, everybody's going to turn to Jerusalem. Everybody's going to turn to worship Yahweh again. It will be what it should have been back in Eden. This is all an intelligent plan, and it's intelligently and deliberately telegraphed, if you have eyes to see it, in the book of Acts and lots of other places. Now, one really cool thing is Paul is driven to get to Spain for some reason, Rome and Spain. If you go back to the map, in Acts 2, the westernmost point is Italy. It's Rome, okay? So he says in Acts 20, remember the account when, Paul goes back to Jerusalem after his missionary journeys, and he had been told In Acts 20, let me see if I have this here. Yes, I do. Acts 20, verse 22, Paul says, "Now behold, I'm going to Jerusalem, constrained by the Spirit." I mean, the Spirit's just you got to get back there, not knowing what will happen to me, except that the Holy Spirit testifies to me in every city that imprisonment and afflictions await me. Paul says, look, I got to get back to Jerusalem. I'm done with my work here. I know bad stuff's going to happen to me because the Spirit tells me that. In Acts 21, when he gets there, he seeks out disciples, stays there 7 days. Through the Spirit, they were telling Paul not to go on to Jerusalem. So now he's in Judea, and he's a little closer. They say, look, Paul, don't go to Jerusalem. Don't go, something bad is going to happen. You know, and it even says elsewhere in the passage that the Spirit was telling them too, when Paul goes to Jerusalem, something bad is going to happen. He's going to get arrested. Something's going to happen. While we were staying for many days, a prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. Coming to us, he took Paul's belt, bound his own feet and hands, and says, "Thus says the Holy Spirit, this is how the Jews of Jerusalem will bind the man who owns this belt and deliver him to the hand of the Gentiles." You know, even a prophet empowered by the Spirit says, Paul, if you go down there, you're going to be arrested, you're going to be taken, you're going to be captured. Well, Paul knows this. This is not news to him. Look at what he said earlier in Acts 19. This is prior to, let's go back, prior to Acts 20, when Paul makes up his mind to go to Jerusalem. Look at what he says. Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and to go to Jerusalem. So as Paul is winding up his work, he's already got Jerusalem on his mind. And look at what he says. He says, after I've been there, I must also see Rome. Paul fully expected to get to Rome. Now, he doesn't know that his arrest in Jerusalem is going to be the means by which he gets to Rome. But he knows he needs to go to Rome. Why? Because he has to keep moving west to get back the Gentile nations that were listed in Genesis 10. We haven't been to the westernmost part yet, a place called Tarshish. If you remember, let's go back. I don't want to give you a headache here, but let's go back. Right here. See, here's Italy. Here's where Rome is. There's a spot mentioned here back in the Table of Nations that we haven't hit yet. Right here. Tarshish. It's an outlier. Paul says, got to get to Jerusalem, and I'm going to go to Rome too. And when he writes to the Romans, he gets arrested in 54. He's under Roman imprisonment. When he writes Romans, he's writing to them saying, hey, I'm going to see you guys. I'm on my way. I'm on trial. I'm going to go appeal to Caesar. I'm going to get to see you guys. Look at what he writes. Thus I make it my ambition to preach the gospel, not where Christ has already been named, lest I build on someone else's foundation. But now, since I no longer have any room for work in these regions, these places where I've done my business, I'm done there. Since I have longed for many years to come to you, Romans, Roman believers, I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain. And when therefore I have completed this and have delivered to them what has been collected, I'll leave for Spain by way of you. Why does Paul believe he's going to get to Spain? Why does Paul want to go there so bad? Why? Again, here's where Acts is going to end up. The journey back to Rome. Here's where he needs to go. Guess what? Guess where Tarshish is? Spain. This is why Paul wants to get there. Paul, in his mind, is living out, let's go back here, he is living out the fulfillment of passages like Isaiah 66, where God said, I'm going to reclaim the nations. Paul is fully conscious of the Old Testament worldview that all these other places are under dominion, and the gospel needs to get to all of them to reclaim them for the God of Israel, who is incarnate in the Christ that he preaches. Paul is in serious trouble. He could end up with a death sentence. Eventually he does get one. But he is determined, I'm going to get to Rome, and it's going to work out because I'm going to visit you guys in passing on my way to Spain, because I got to get there because it's the last place on the list. I mean, he's moving west. It's an intelligent plan. He knows what he's doing. He is fully cognizant of the Old Testament worldview. Look at his vocabulary for the powers of darkness. Now, Paul does use the word demons. You know, we have Deuteronomy 32:8. But when the Most High divided the nations, divides them up under the number of the sons of God, and those sons of God become corrupt, and they seduce Israel. Deuteronomy 32:17, a few verses after the division of the nations is talked about. In Deuteronomy 32, it says that the Israelites worshipped demons and not God, gods they had not known, the gods that had not been allotted to them. Paul does talk about demons, and the word there in Deuteronomy 32 is shadim, comes from shadu. It is a guardian entity. Why is that language used? Because the other gods guard their turf. They own it. Okay, they were given it, and they consider it their domain. That's why you have this language. And look at what Paul does. When Paul uses the word demons, he uses it in 1 Corinthians 10, where he's quoting Deuteronomy 32. It's not an accident. But the other vocabulary he uses, rulers, principalities, powers, or authorities, the exousia, powers, dunamis, dominions, lords, thrones, world rulers, except for dunamis, which I think occurs once. All of these other terms are terms of geographical rulership. Again, this is not an accident. Now, what's really cool about this, get it in your head. In the Old Testament worldview, God, the real God, Yahweh, the unique Yahweh, the one who is an Elohim, but no other Elohim is him, the one who chooses to surrender these nations, chooses to disinherit them, to throw them, give them what they want, punish them, put them under the authority of other gods, and then he takes Israel as his own in Deuteronomy 4, Deuteronomy 32. And the rest of the story is Israel against the nations, the gods against Yahweh. That's your Old Testament. And then we see what happens in Acts about this great reversal. Well, where does it end? Because we, as humans, back in Eden, in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and of course the garden scene, we were supposed to be part of this. Well, guess what? We are going to be part of it, and Revelation says that. And a lot of other passages that I have to skip for time. The whole concept in the New Testament of divine sonship includes ruling and reigning with Christ. Look at some of these passages in light of the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Revelation 2, Jesus is speaking. Look at what he says. Nevertheless, hold fast to what you have until I come. And the one who conquers and who keeps my works until the end, I will give him authority over the nations. And now catch this. And he, this one that overcomes, this believer, this hypothetical believer, he will shepherd them with an iron rod and will break them in pieces like jars made of clay. Do you realize where this comes from, the iron rod? That comes from a messianic psalm. Jesus, who is the Messiah, is describing believers like Messiah, shepherding with an iron rod, authority over the nations. And then he continues, and also I have also received from my Father this authority, and I will give him, the believer, I'll give him the morning star. Well, what's that? Well, the morning star language in Revelation 2:28 is messianic as well. It refers to a divine being. Divine beings were referred to as stars. Job 38:7, the sons of God are called the stars of God, and other passages. But this one here, the morning star language associated with the Messiah, with Jesus is the speaker, harkens back to Numbers 24:17. The star language associated with the Messiah. A star will go out from Jacob, and a scepter will rise from Israel. Notice that the star doesn't rise over Jacob. Jacob isn't territory. Jacob is Israel. But this passage is not quoted in the birth story of Jesus by the Magi. That is not what it refers to. This is not about the Star of Bethlehem, where it identifies the place where Messiah is born. This says a star will go out from Jacob. It refers to a person who will come from Israel and have a scepter. Scepter will rise from Israel. It refers to a person, it refers to the Messiah. Later in the book of Revelation, we have morning star language again. Jesus refers to his messianic standing in the same language. I am the root and the descendant of David. I am the bright morning star. Well, he just said in Revelation 2 that he will give the morning star to believers. And he quoted Psalm 2 about believers ruling with a rod of iron the way Messiah does, the way Messiah is supposed to. Do you realize what's happening here? Jesus himself is connecting us, believers, with him and with his right to reign. Who? The nations who were disinherited. Revelation 3, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, indeed I will come into him and dine with him, and he with me. We know that part. We know that part. We got nice pictures of it. Of course, we skip verse 21, which is very unfortunate. The one who conquers, I will grant to him to sit down with me on my throne, as I also have conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. We're not going to be floating on clouds, playing harps, and having a jam session around the throne of God. That is not what heaven is. Heaven is dominion over a global Eden. We rule it, we enjoy it, as was originally intended, and there is no more threat of evil.